Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I am Brahima Kulibali, the Vice President of the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the Girls Education Research and Policy Symposium hosted by our Center for Universal Education. This symposium could not have been more timely. The world today faces a panoply of challenges: a global pandemic, economic turmoil, climate change, armed conflict, and humanitarian disasters, among others. It's unlike any other time in recent history. These social, environmental, and health crises exacerbate existing gender inequalities and obstruct the pathways for girls and young women seeking quality education, economic empowerment, and improved life outcomes. With crisis mode ever more common, the critical question becomes, what can we do to help protect and promote the right of girls and young women, especially in times of crisis? Girls' education cannot be a privilege that is guaranteed to some under ideal conditions. It is a right that must be guaranteed to all, and we must turn and maintain our focus on girls and young women living in the most challenging circumstances. In this plenary conversation that kicks off the three-day symposium, you will hear from the 2021 cohort of the Echidna Global Scholars. The Echidna Global Scholars Visiting Fellowship Programs brings emerging leaders in girls' education from the global south on a 6-month fellowship at Brookings, during which time they pursue individual research, focus on improving learning opportunities and life outcomes for girls and young women in low and middle income countries. This cohort of scholars bring a diversity of background and a richness of perspective to their studies, consisting of technical and vocational agriculture education in Afghanistan, women entrepreneurship capacity building in Vietnam, the digital mentoring in support of female labor force participation in India, and gender-responsive education in emergencies in Nigeria. They will share lessons from their research over the past 6 months to help us understand what is it that we can do as researchers, practitioners, or policymakers to ensure that every girl and every young woman can fully exercise her rights in and through education. We could not have been more proud to host this impressive, diverse group of scholars. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for this conversation, Brookings Fellow, Jennifer O'Donoghue, who has done an outstanding job coordinating our Echidna Global Scholars Program and is leading our work on girls' education more broadly. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Kul, and thank you to all of you for joining us today for what we hope will be an engaging and thought-provoking conversation with the Echidna Global Scholars 2021. Throughout this discussion, we invite you to share your questions and comments on Twitter using the hashtag EGSP21 or to email them to events@brookings.edu. Before we invite the scholars on screen, it is my great pleasure to introduce Tadese, who, in line with the theme of this year's symposium, will help set the stage for understanding some of the challenges girls and young women face today. Eden is an award-winning journalist, social entrepreneur, digital innovator, and human rights activist from Ethiopia. She is the founder and CEO of Invicta, an award-winning social impact platform that connects refugees and internally displaced youth with courses, skills training, and job opportunities online. As a proud nonconformist and global citizen, she strives to empower young people to cultivate their skills, develop habits for success, and unlock their inner potential. Eden is passionate about leveraging innovation, diversity, and leadership to create sustainable solutions. Her professional experience spans across social innovation, education, sustainable economic development, women's empowerment, and leadership. Eden is an African Union Youth Innovator, a Global Youth Ambassador for Their World, and a Future Rising Fellow at Girl Rising. Welcome, Eden, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Good morning, everyone. First and foremost, I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to the Brookings Institution for inviting me to be part of this very exciting event. So my educational journey began before I even stepped foot in a school. I was raised in the slums with 11 siblings, 8 of whom are female. So I was introduced to inequality, gender discrimination, and poverty before I even learned the alphabet. My father worked as a finance manager at a top private school in Ethiopia, and thus my siblings and I were very fortunate to attend this prestigious school on a full tuition waiver. So I spent 15 years at the school, from kindergarten all the way to grade 13. And my experiences at the school were nothing short of phenomenal. I learned a great deal about myself and where I fit into the world. I was part of many associations where I established myself as a leader, as an empowered female leader. And in 10th grade, my teacher actually told me, Eden, I want to hear from you 15 years from now from the United Nations headquarters in New York as you are shaking things up. And today I'm proud to say that I am working for the United Nations to build strong and sustainable communities across Ethiopia. Yeah, back then, coming home to a house in the slums was a very bewildering experience for me. I was exposed at a very early age to life on both sides of the economic spectrum, and that to this day remains my biggest educational lesson. I was blessed by incredibly caring and supportive teachers who inspired me to give back in any capacity that I could. So I volunteered with many NGOs and educational institutions who supported marginalized young girls, refugees, and orphans with early childhood education. And this experience opened my eyes to all the shortcomings of our education system, whether it was a poorly designed curriculum, overcrowded classrooms, or lack of mentorship. These young girls were not being afforded the right to quality education. This was very frustrating for me, but as an activist, I had to speak out. I was invited to speak at the largest political conference in Africa, where I got to share my ideas on developing a comprehensive educational policy to tackle inequality and unemployment in Ethiopia. My experiences then have enabled me to meet many inspiring change makers, from grassroots organizations to UN agencies, who are changing the dynamic and reshaping the conversation around girls' education and empowerment through education. This gives me hope for a brighter tomorrow, one where collective action is taken towards a common vision. But I am also reminded of the dire challenges, whether political or environmental, that continue to exist and hinder global efforts in moving the education agenda forward. In 2017, as a freshman in college, I was distraught to read on the news that Africa was experiencing the worst refugee crisis in history. 2 million South Sudanese refugees fled to neighboring countries, Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia, my home country. This news hit my conscience like a lightning bolt. I had to do something. So I took a gap year to travel back home to Ethiopia and work in a refugee settlement. With the goal to support displaced youth with education, a friend and I set up a learning resource center. We impacted many lives, and I knew then and then what my calling was, which is to help refugees find meaningful education and empowerment through education. In 2019, with the help of a Norwegian impact accelerator, I launched Invicta, an award-winning startup that supports more than 27,000 refugees and internally displaced people with education, skills development, and sustainable employment. It all started with a firm vision, an urge, a plea. That is, no one should be denied their right to access quality education. This year, I'm proud to say, as a Future Rising Fellow, I'm working on a documentary to highlight how girls and women are disproportionately affected by the desert locust plague, which is a climate crisis in southern Ethiopia. My hope today is that we all take away something important and meaningful from this discussion. And thank you so much for tuning in. I look forward to a productive dialogue.
Thank you so much, Eden, for providing us with a very clear picture of just what is at stake and how critical it is to promote and protect girls' rights at all times, and especially in the midst of the types of crises and challenges you described. I love your expression of collective action towards a common vision, and hopefully that's what we can continue to work on through this conversation today. We now turn to our panel conversation with the 2021 Echidna Global Scholars. Joining us today is Nangilai Atal, founder of the nonprofit organization HODE, meaning a resilient decision, dedicated to promoting girls' education in rural areas of Afghanistan. Nangilai served as senior policy specialist at the Technical and Vocational Education and Training Authority of Afghanistan from 2019 to 2021. Nangilai received international recognition in 2014 when the UN Envoy for Global Education awarded him the UN Youth Courage Award. He served as lecturer at the Dunya University of Afghanistan and at the National Institute of Management and Administration. As a Fulbright Fellow, he completed a master's degree in human resources at Golden Gate University in San Francisco, and he is currently pursuing his PhD in international education at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Our second 2021 Echidna Global Scholar, Arundhati Gupta, is the founder and CEO of Mentor Together, a nonprofit organization in India that provides mentoring relationships and networks to young people from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds. Mentor Together runs programs at schools and universities across India through partnerships with state governments, NGOs, corporate partners, and over 1,000 carefully screened and trained volunteer mentors. Arundhati is also an Ashoka Fellow, a World Economic Forum Global Shaper, and an International Youth Foundation Global Laureate. She completed her master's in finance at the Manchester Business School as a Commonwealth Scholar and graduated as the top rank holder from the Bangalore University's Bachelor of Commerce program in 2007. Also with us today is Edem Osai, a lawyer with over 15 years working in child rights advocacy and education. As the founder and current director of Mayen, a nonprofit based in Nigeria working to advance young people's development through equity in education, entrepreneurship development, and practical civic engagement, Edem initiated Girls Without Borders, a school club-based program that teaches adolescent girls about their rights and how to exercise their own agency. Edem holds a master's degree in international development and policy from the University of Chicago, where she was selected as an inaugural Obama Scholar by the Obama Foundation. In 2016, she was also named a Mandela Washington Fellow by the United States State Department. Our final 2021 Echidna Global Scholar is Tran Tran. Tran has dedicated over 20 years to working in the education sector. She is co-founder and current managing director of ProPath Education Group and the inaugural Vietnam country manager for Girl Rising. In 2020, she initiated the Future for Women program, the US government-funded training and mentoring program for female Vietnamese entrepreneurs to promote women's equality and empowerment. She was selected for the Humphrey Fellowship by the US Department of State, the Leadership Fellowship by the East-West Center, and the Nuffic Fellowship by the Dutch government. Tran is currently pursuing her doctoral degree at Andrews University. Thank you all for being here today. And as always, I am honored to be in such illustrious company, and especially even more after reading all of your very impressive biographies. And to our public, before we begin our conversation, I'd just like to remind you all that you can share your questions and comments on Twitter using the hashtag EGSP21, or you can email them to events@brookings.edu. Now, to start our conversation, could each of you just briefly share the focus of your research and a bit more about how your own life experiences and challenges have shaped your interest in this topic? Edem, why don't we start with you?
Thank you very much, Jen. I'm very excited to be part of this important conversation. My research is focused on education in emergencies and how they affect girls. I'm exploring this through the School on Air intervention launched by the Oyo State government in Nigeria during the school closures led by COVID-19 in 2020. I became interested in education in emergencies as a result of a childhood experience involving the loss of my father at the age of 13. At that time, our family experienced difficulty financially, and my mother had to take up multiple roles to be able to support our education. I was fortunate in that my mother valued education and had relevant labor market skills to be able to gain these particular jobs to accommodate our education. But I recognize that not many girls are as fortunate as I was. Having a young neighbor who was a direct evidence of that unfortunate situation many girls face taught me early that the loss of social protective networks and the interaction of gender factors as well as economic factors renders girls' education vulnerable in moments like that. And so I am very interested in exploring how emergencies, myriad emergencies, whether it's the public health related one that we have recently witnessed in the COVID pandemic, or other kinds of emergencies like natural disasters and the likes, affect girls' schooling. I hope to be able to draw lessons from these experiences to enable governments properly safeguard girls' education at moments like that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edem. Arundhati, could you share with us a bit about your research?
Sure, thank you so much, Jen. So my work as an Echidna Global Scholar looks at the role of digital mentoring ecosystems in supporting young women in post-secondary or tertiary education as they look at their workforce readiness as well as their workforce transition plans. This is a really important issue in India because India, even pre-COVID, has had a very low female labor force participation rate of about 22%, which had been also declining very rapidly. And this overall is a real puzzle in the country because if we look at our economic growth, as well as the increasing participation of young women, especially in post-secondary or tertiary education, the labor force participation rate just doesn't add up. So what I look at in my research is the triple impact of a skills deficit, a network gap, and restrictive gender norms that uniquely come together to constrain equitable participation of young women and the role of digital mentoring in countering that. Coming to your second question about how my interest grew in youth mentorship, I'd say even today I can remember vividly the experience of being mentored as a young person, very much like how Eden so wonderfully recounted in her opening remarks. I was a business student in university, set on a career path in finance, when a mentor encouraged me to get involved in community service. And that simple act of connecting and volunteering and connecting my skills and abilities to opportunities around me where I could be of greater service to people was the most empowering thing I experienced as a young person. And really, there wasn't any looking back after that. So 2 years after graduating from university, I set up Mentor Together, a nonprofit organization to pay forward that kind of mentorship that had been so catalytic in my life, focusing especially on young people from marginalized backgrounds, and just to ensure that mentoring is not something left up to chance.
Great, thank you, Arundhati. Chan, I'll turn it over to you. Same question.
Thank you, Jen. My interest is about developing women's entrepreneurship through education and training. Actually, over 20 years ago, while in college, I started my first business, which was selling handmade greeting cards. But the business closed just 1 year after that because I had to fully focus on my study as requested by my parents. I was born not so long after the Vietnam War, and with all challenges and uncertainty then, I know that my parents always expected me to have a university degree and secure a safe and respected job, typically for women, like teachers or nurse. And at school, I was never prepared for self-employment. Looking broader, as Vietnam is influenced by Confucianism, from an early age, I was taught 4 virtues, which requires Vietnamese women to have first good housekeeping skills, and then appearance, speech, and morality. So women are expected to play the role of a caregiver in the family. And the cultural and social norms and lack of knowledge and confidence kept me from turning my ideas into business for a long time until over 10 years ago. And I had the chance to attend a training program in the States and were first exposed to the concept of women's leadership and entrepreneurship. And that is when I opened my eyes and realized how important education and training can promote women's entrepreneurship. And it has aroused my current interest.
Great, thank you so much, Chan. And Nangilai, we'll close this introductory section with you. If you could share with us about your research topic and how you arrived at that.
Sure, thank you, Jennifer. My research focus is on policy pathways that could increase girls' participation in formal agriculture education in Afghanistan. Agriculture is considered as the top growth sector. 70% of rural women are either directly or indirectly involved in agriculture. But when it comes to formal agriculture education, girls' participation is just about 12%. That is my research focus in how I got into girls' education. I grew up in the countryside on a farmland. My parents didn't have any formal education, but my mom was having religious education from her father. So she would teach basic religious subjects to the girls from the immediate neighborhood in our village. And at that point, I was going to school. When I would come back, then I would teach those girls how to read and write. That was the beginning for me and a natural bond that started. And for the past since then, I've been involved in promoting education And for the past 2 or so years, I was working as senior policy specialist with the Tibet Authority, largely focusing on agriculture education.
Thank you, Nangila, and thank you to all. I know for everyone watching, this is a very quick introduction to the scholars' work. Just want to let you all know that each of the scholars will be hosting a deep dive virtual workshop into their specific topics. So please check our event page where you can find more information and register for these longer conversations around their work. Now I'd like to have more of a conversation, so feel free to jump in when you want to. But really thinking how an important aspect of all of your research projects was connecting directly with girls and young women, whether this was through interviews, focus group discussions, surveys, or even skills assessments. What have you learned about what matters most to these girls and young women as they navigate crisis situations? And how can this inform what's most important for us to focus on when emergencies strike? Arundhati, let's just kick it off with you and then everyone else can jump in.
Sure, thank you. So the digital mentoring program that I studied in my policy brief, the Mentor to Go program, reached over 7,000 young people across 10 states of India in the 12 months that immediately followed the COVID-19 pandemic's influence on college campuses closing across the country. And despite not targeting girls specifically, what we found to our surprise was that 61% of all the enrollments in the program in that 12-month period were of young women in tertiary education. And young women accessed 71% of all the mentorships we facilitated in that 12-month period. So I would say that we saw actually an incredible demand for digitally mediated support services, especially to formal education, while it was also happening virtually, but demand for other services. And I was struck, I think, in the policy brief and in the research process by how clear the articulation was of the young women I spoke with. They were so clear about why they were in tertiary education. It was their pathway to becoming economically empowered. They so clearly understood the challenges they were up against. They especially identified the lack of work readiness skills and the very small networks they were part of. So they were very eager and aspirational to get these support services that could help them make the most of their period of tertiary education, even during the midst of a global pandemic.
Jumping in on Arundhati's contribution, I'd say I experienced something very similar in my interactive sessions through several focus groups with adolescent girls in upper secondary level in Oyo State, Nigeria, across both rural and urban areas of the state. Girls expressed a keen fervor for learning, which did not dissipate or diminish in any way during the crisis. Indeed, girls continue to demonstrate a hunger to access educational opportunities in moments of crisis. When asked, for instance, in those qualitative interactive sessions, what influenced their return back to school after the protracted school closures, girls had blank stares looking at me and said the alternative was unthinkable. So girls have clearly identified schooling as a pathway to the fulfillment of their dreams and aspirations in the future. Unfortunately, we also found in those sessions that families who represent gatekeepers as well as support systems in the lives of girls often stand as a form of impediment to girls' opportunities for learning in moments like that. There were several issues raised, such as lack of control of their time, and also girls were unable to access relevant tools required for accessing the broadcast-based forms of learning as a result of parental distrust of these tools. So despite this huge interest in learning, girls continue to face barriers, which often could be represented as families.
For my study, I was impressed by the strong learning motivation and commitment of the young women who are aspiring to become entrepreneurs. They were well aware that entrepreneurship is a long-term learning process, and they expected to maximize the benefits of the learning opportunity they have. For example, although time poverty is considered a major barrier to women's learning, the women in my study did not express concern about the length of the program, but they were more concerned about whether the program would give them enough time for interaction and practice. Unfortunately, the program they had enrolled before were generally intensive, lasting 1 to 6 days normally, so they did not have time to acquire the knowledge and skills or build a network they need and learn from others.
Like for other scholars, what I would say is that the Afghan girls or having resolute aspiration despite conflict in so many challenges. We surveyed over 300 young girls from agriculture schools and institutes, and they want to become agriculture engineers, they want to become veterinary doctors in faculty. We found that 90% of girls that we surveyed, they want to pursue a degree in applied agriculture. They are highly aspirational, but unfortunately, that degree does not exist within the agriculture TVET system currently, and their pathways, unfortunately, to higher education are very limited due to policy hurdles.
I think I'm just going to jump in here quickly. Adam, you mentioned family as both a gatekeeper and a support. Could you share with us a little bit more about what you found in that sense?
Yes, Jen, families are very critical. Girls are enclosed within, gatekeeping and support structures, as we know, and this plays out even more strongly in times of crisis when typically schooling is disrupted. And as we saw in the COVID pandemic, young children have to learn from home. And so the, competing activities in the lives of young girls as laid for them by their families, we pretty much define whether they're able to access learning opportunities or not. If families do not place educational and learning opportunities at the top of the priority or hierarchy in these activities, then girls are unfortunately barred from participating. What we found was families were critical with respect to access. Girls, like I said, lacked significant control of their time, whether it was in the form of increased house chores or just having to support family income by activities in farms, especially for girls in rural parts of Oyo State, or also just, being sent to learn a skill or vocation, particularly dressmaking and hairdressing. Girls were unable to carve out time to actually participate in these telecast, learning programs. Another critical thing is families, beyond just creating opportunities for access, are also very critical for the quality that girls are able to derive out of these programs. Girls need support. They want to ask questions. They need their parents to be on hand to be able to guide them in understanding the content, or older siblings for that matter. And so families are very critical for both support in terms of access to the programs and the quality derived. And girls in particularly said that if the government wants us to learn from home, they have to tell our parents. Otherwise, as they said, our parents will continue disturbing us. So this informs, education planners about the very critical role that families play in moments of crisis.
Let me add to Adam's point about the role of the families, especially for women. In my study, the women entrepreneurs play the role of parents. And that's why the families play a role in their entrepreneurial experience as a source of obligations and duty. Due to COVID lockdown, and actually even before COVID, because of the gender role in the family, as I shared at the beginning, so women did more housework and childcare than men. And they share with me that because of these unpaid domestic responsibility, they had challenges in executing their entrepreneurial ideas into a business plan. So they wish to see more family-friendly policies from the government in the future.
Yeah, building on what Tran mentioned in Edom about family, in our survey, we found that there is a persistent negative perception of agriculture as second-class education. And that perception is pushing away girls from pursuing agriculture education. And 37% of our respondents said that they needed some type of parental permission to study agriculture, or that other girls were pushed away because they could not come to agriculture education due to lack of parental permission. And 40% of agriculture veterinary students mentioned that they were pushed away by their relatives to stop studying agriculture. So family is critical, and especially having a positive perception to support their education is instrumental.
think rounding up this group of reflections on family, secondary research shows that family norms around the role of women, societal norms enforced by family often on the role of women being primarily that of a caregiver or a caretaker is one of the main reasons why female labor force participation in India drops off in that period when those responsibilities increase and dishearteningly stays that low, and women don't tend to re-enter the workforce at a later time period either. So what I found in the study, in the policy brief and the period of research, was that there was one positive norm and one norm that looked slightly concerning. The positive norm was that in India today, the tertiary education or post-secondary education of young women is actually encouraged very positively. Today, 19 million young men and women equally participate in tertiary education in India. And I found that in the study where the young women had enjoyed a lot of freedom of decision-making in terms of the course they could study, the college, and overwhelmingly tertiary education was supported and championed by their parents. But then look to just that 4-5 period ahead in their lifespan. Young women were actively planning for their aspirations as empowered young women, but their families were imminently planning for their marriage. Heartbreakingly, one of the quotes that a young girl who was just 19, 20 told me is, as she looked at her life ahead, she said, "I have so little time. My family has a set schedule in which everything has to happen. I study, I get married, then I do a job, then all these other things follow. So I have so little time to pursue all of these ambitions of mine." So I think that was the interesting contrast where norms have changed to make tertiary education of young women in India something championed and supported, but not what follows from there.
Thank you all. That's I feel like we could continue to have a conversation just about that one topic. But I want to return to something that, Tran, you mentioned in your introduction around, how women and women entrepreneurs in particular in your study wanted to learn and a more sort of relational style of learning. And this was something that seemed to come out in all of your research. Maybe, Tran, you could start by sharing with us a bit more about what this meant for the young women in your study.
Sure, Jen. What I found from my study is that relational learning for women entrepreneurs is not the relations between trainers and learners. It is more about the real world connections. And those connections come from, for example, mentorship, because they say that with a mentor, they would be able to learn from real experiences and then open up new business network. This is especially helpful because previous research and reports shows that limited network has been a major challenge for Vietnamese women entrepreneurs, especially during COVID pandemic. And connection also come from panel talks, site visits, and peer groups. They say that in panel talks, they love hearing success and failure stories from experienced entrepreneurs. They also like to see what entrepreneurs handle the everyday work in their working lives from site visit, and they felt like more motivated sharing their challenges and their business plan with the peers. So the connection with those role models make them become active learners who acquire knowledge and skills through observing, analyzing, and reflecting.
Yeah, Tran referred to role models. One thing that we found in our survey was lack of female teachers and role models in the case of Afghanistan in agriculture education. Of all the permanent contracted teachers in agriculture, just 3% were women. And of all the short-term contracted teachers, only 8% were women. So lack of female teacher was a substantial issue that actually girls wanted to have female teachers. And in some cases that could convince also their families as well. So female teachers was one of like the key findings that we found that girl students were lacking.
Building up on that, we also, in our research with adolescent girls in upper secondary school, discovered that, gender plays a strong role in how we learn. And girls expressed that very keen, desire for relational learning in the form of wanting to ask questions, wanting to seek clarification, wanting detailed explanations. Unfortunately, through that mediated form of learning using technology, the lack of interactive features built into the telecast or broadcast forms of lesson delivery became a limitation for girls. Girls expressed, for instance, that they became used to taking notes and then taking these notes to their private lesson teachers to ask for explanation. So it is critical from the voices of girls that, formats in this nature, as we enter into a world where we will continue to leverage technologies to deliver classroom learning beyond the classroom, that interactive features are built into these portals so that girls can engage, girls can ask and seek detailed explanation and, continue to derive contextual analogies to be able to connect the concepts that they are taught.
I'd say, like Edom shared, the experience of girls sort of looking at formal learning and then what they need to do supplementary to that. Digital mentoring was definitely perceived as being very complementary and supplementary to the experience of formal learning, and was actually championed in a way by higher education institutions in our case as something that teachers could encourage their students to participate in and actively drive enrollment in mentorship. Two things that I found in terms of this whole learning with mentors and learning through mentors is we did see large changes in career decision making, emotional management, a whole host of work readiness skills that girls learned through their mentors. And I think the mentors' ability to really take their life experiences and take these topics that can sometimes seem abstract or even not even understood in a way like what do I do with communication? What is problem solving? And take those and make them very real for students while in education itself, to realize how this is the bridge to becoming, active in the workforce and is valued by employers. And the second thing that I found from the digital mentoring network creation is it wasn't just the one-to-one learning with the mentors, like Chan said, because the network gap is so stark. Most women are not surrounded. Young women in our program knew on average 5 to 7 people in the career of their choice. But look at the network of mentors. In any of these mentors have such rich social capital networks. So we were able to create a very large and rich, diverse network, primarily because of digital technologies allowing us to do this at scale.
Thank you. One of the things that Chan mentioned, and then I know from having read all of your wonderful policy briefs, is the importance of that real world connection. So many of you have talked about networks and that relational piece. And so I think continuing on that theme, this idea of the real world connection or the relevance that girls and young women see in their education, that is, how does it build pathways to economic empowerment? How does it build pathways to gender equality, more broadly speaking? Maybe Nangile, you've talked a lot and in your work looked at this idea of the lack of pathways to work as a factor dissuading girls and their families from choosing agricultural education. Could you share with us a bit more about that?
Yes, sure. As I earlier indicated, that lack of female teachers is a critical challenge. So if girls want to become teacher, which our survey found 87% want to become teachers, especially agriculture, veterinary institute graduates. But current policy would not allow them to become, they would not become eligible or shortlisted to become teachers. And also there are challenges both in the public sector and in the private sector, absence of career pathways to these girls. For instance, at the Ministry of Agriculture, the entire female workforce at the Ministry of Agriculture is just 7%. So that indicates how low number of opportunities are there. We found that 50% of our respondents said if employment and jobs were provided, your families would be more encouraging. Your relatives would be more encouraging. But unfortunately, all those pathways are not available, resulting in a lost potential of a lot of young women and girls.
I mean, very interesting point that Nangalai raised is because two things. During a crisis, relevance takes on a broader meaning beyond just formal subjects. As we know, education in emergencies is not just interested in making sure that young people can safely access qualitative learning that's relevant to their needs, but that also those young people who face higher risks are able to gain psychosocial and physical support in those times. Unfortunately, we found that School on Air was very focused on formal subjects and did not provide for the holistic, needs of girls in that moment, ranging from their psychosocial needs, their health needs, and even just addressing disinformation trends within that period. The second thing, I found is that, as we know, evidence shows that schools, traditional schools, are sites for reinforcing existing societal biases. So we're curious to see how moving to broadcast-based forms of schools, what did School on Air present to girls in terms of the gendered picture of the world? And it was evident through the findings that girls, were presented with content that reinforced existing societal and gender biases. For instance, just in the form of male-female teacher distribution across the subjects, with male teachers dominating math, physics, economics, government, and all these productivity and numerical-based subjects, as opposed to female teachers featuring more strongly in English and literature. Girls were presented with certain vocations and fields and disciplines as masculine and the others as female. And we also saw that, in some subjects, certain vocations, like terms like president, government, were ascribed using specific male pronouns, thus painting a picture of a world where these positions and future leadership occupations are specifically masculine.
I found something similar to what Adams just shared about the focus of the program and then the gender bias. While the women entrepreneurs in my study said that feminine leadership traits such as perfectionism or softness or sensitivity was not a weakness for leaders. They still felt like they needed to learn about traditionally viewed masculine traits such as assertiveness or risk tolerance or determination to become more successful. So we can see that although they were progressive not to undervalue feminine traits, they were actually facing gender identity conflict between being a woman and being an entrepreneur or leader. So we will definitely need a program that not only equip them with technical knowledge and skills, but also to transform their mindset and to increase their self-efficacy.
As a callback to right at the start, I spoke about 3 things that young women will need for a more equitable pathway to economic empowerment, tackling the skills deficit, addressing the network gap, and changing those restrictive gender norms. Through digital mentoring, we saw the first 2 can be done within the program itself. We can help young women with skills, we can grow their networks and introduce them to these larger, richer opportunities. But the question still remains of how do we change the mindsets and traditional mindsets of families and communities. What I found is that we can create a very egalitarian network, which was what girls experienced in mentorship. Their mentors actively championed all their dreams and aspirations. A mentor told me, it's not my mentee's dream, it's my dream, it's our dream, what we all hold as a responsibility to fulfill. But the question is that if that network doesn't actively, it's not within the network of mentoring that we need to champion these norms. It's outside of the network of mentoring that we need to actively champion these norms and change the mindsets of traditional families and communities. And that is what I see from as a big takeaway from my research as the urgent need in India, that we have to say that this is the right of every girl and every woman to work, to have her rightful place in the economy, and what role of a secondary socialization network that champions these norms has in changing the traditional mindsets faster and quicker than it would take over many generations.
Great, thank you all so much. I continue, and here I have spent the past 6 months with you on this research, but I continue thinking that I wish the conversation were longer on all of these topics. So I hope that people will be able to join you all in your workshops over the next few days so that they can dig deeper with you on all of these issues. I want to move us a bit to away from findings to talk more specifically about recommendations. And we've had many questions coming in that have been focused on really, how can we ensure, what can we do, what needs to be done, and specific questions related to some of the topics that you all have have studied like adolescent girls in particular, as in Adam's case with leveraging technology, as in the case of Arundhati, with families who are losing their livelihoods, I think in the case of all of you, and also in rural access in particular. So I'm sort of folding in many questions into one from the audience into one question for all of you. But if you could just share with us what you see as some of the practical implications of your research that can help protect and promote girls and young women's rights and future pathways in times of crisis. So what does your research say needs to be done as we move forward? And why don't we start with you, Arundhati?
Sure. So I would say very much that at this time, as India is sort of planning its economic and social recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, stemming this tide of very low female labor force participation is even more vital, even more critical. And given the findings and the evidence that digital mentoring can help young women with skills, networks, and transformative gender norms, the issue at hand is really about how do we ensure, one, young women can continue to access and enroll in tertiary education. We can't take this for granted, especially like you said, the economic impact of COVID on the livelihoods of everyone in the informal sector, especially, which is where most of the mentees, their families worked in. So I would say that ensuring very targeted need-based financial support to marginalized girls in India, and India has a strong framework of corporate social responsibility that can champion that financial support to ensure girls can continue enrolling and staying in tertiary education. The second is then ensuring inclusive participation of young women in tertiary education. And I propose a digital mentoring ecosystem with a nodal partner at the state that can coordinate these activities, actively champion mentoring through the higher educational institutions, and that being really a model to ensure widespread access to mentoring. And then the third thing is, if young women are in mentorship, are in education, can access mentorship, how can we do this with quality and impact at scale? While mentoring is so intuitively powerful, in implementing it, you have to be very careful about the kinds of mentors you choose, what training they receive, what mentors and mentees actually do in the mentorship. How do you support creation of social capital networks, changing norms? All of those need careful planning, monitoring, and impact measurement. So I propose how that can be done through different players and actors in this ecosystem.
Great, thank you so much, Arundhati. Tran, why don't we move on to you?
Based on my findings, I think that to build the next generations of female entrepreneurs who can survive and thrive, my primary recommendation for the policy makers is to ensure that female entrepreneurs receive the support they really need. So the first step must be to identify what they need. However, in the times of crisis like what we are now facing with all the uncertainty, to help them to prepare better for the future. Those interventions, while should starting from their needs, but should not end there, but should guide them to envision the future expectations of the entrepreneurs. And last but not least, because capacity building or education cannot be a standalone effort, so policies and programs should support one another. So the next recommendation is to ensure both vertical and horizontal approaches, which means that women are placed at the center of the national effort. Then there's a close coordination among government agencies and private sector and civil society as well.
Thank you, Chan. Nangilai, what practical recommendations would you give?
Thank you, Jennifer. Let me respond that in two ways. Number one, the most important urgent need right now for providing funding and support to the needs of Afghan girls in their educational aspiration. And I think the international community needs to continue the funding that it provided for the past 20 years. We would not be able to implement some of the recommendations that we have without the support of international community. I would like to propose that in order to increase girls' participation in agriculture education, since their participation is really instrumental to food production and food security a highest priority right now for the people of Afghanistan. So number one is that we need to introduce agriculture as first-class education. And to do that, we need early intervention as early as secondary education through curricula to normalize that process. And number two is increasing the number of female teachers through the Tibet Authority shall introduce a new teacher recruitment or a separate teacher recruitment procedures that make it easier for female applicants, and also make eligible agriculture veterinary institutes graduates to become teachers. And in addition to that, improving quality. Quality is really instrumental. Now we need to, or the Tibet Authority with the support of international community shall establish new labs and forming learning forums where young women and girls can learn. But that cannot be done without the support of international community and their continuous funding. It's our shared responsibility, and we shall not abandon our responsibilities towards the young women and girls of Afghanistan.
I mean, just building up on everything that Tran, Arundhati, and Nangila have shared has, for me, demonstrated how foundational education is to all the aspirations of girls across the world. And this places a huge responsibility on education planners and governments all over. Because what we are finding is that in responding to crisis, though appearing in different forms and shapes and sizes, the one thing we can all agree on is that crisis itself as a concept is a constant. And so having resilient systems in education to deal with crisis requires a long-term system of planning. We need to establish long-term systems. We need to have people with a clear, specific mandate to deal with education in emergencies. We need to have actors. We need to have, training, funding, all dedicated towards education in emergencies. And so these structures are pillars that exist and can easily address, all the changing fluid situations that crisis presents. And as we create these permanent systems, it is critical to ensure that girls' voices are placed at the center of these systems. All too often, societies are often used to muting the voices of girls. We don't seek their opinion. We don't ask their opinions. We plan and think for girls. Moving into a new world where girls' needs are properly built into education emergency systems requires us to consult directly with girls to hear their insights and building these perspectives into the features and programs that we create for them. And finally, it is critical that we engage the families of girls. Girls exist, as I stated earlier, within cycles of gatekeepers and support systems, families, and making sure that education in emergency reaches the most vulnerable girls requires us to partner with families and communities to ensure that they are pathways and partners in reaching the girls themselves. Communities in Oyo State, for instance, examples can be seen of how some communities set up temporary or pseudo school on air viewing locations. This shows that this instinct exists and governments can leverage this to scale more community involvement to ensure that girls are reached even in times of crisis. Finally, I'll just end by saying that if we are going to ensure a future and if we envision societies in the future where girls' potential is fully harnessed and tapped, we have to adopt a different way of dealing with crisis and dealing with education in general. Girls have to be placed at the center, girls must be consulted, and systems must be built that are permanent for dealing with crisis. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Those are, really powerful recommendations that you're making to both policymakers and practitioners and funders and others locally and internationally. I think I'm going to try to sneak in one last question before I turn the floor back over to Eden. I think this is a really interesting question for us to go out on. Comes from Chris, and he or she has asked, whether the barriers that you're seeing and whether, with the experience of the research that you have, we feel like barriers are being reinforced at this time, or do you feel like these crises that we're living today could potentially be a moment of disruption? And if you could take, 15, 20 seconds maybe to answer that question. I know it's a much deeper question, but what do you think? Are we at a moment of disruption or of reinforcing?
I can set that off in 15 seconds by simply saying that COVID represents a teachable moment, and every teachable moment definitely is disrupting what we knew as the old pattern. For instance, we're all envisioning for the future teaching beyond the classroom in very practical ways. This means that we enter into a world where we move along with technology to provide the services that we have done traditionally through in-person, relationships. But what do we need to do to make sure that we do not reinforce old barriers as we move into these futures is to make sure that the most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable schooling populations, their needs are factored in and addressed within these new worlds that we envision. And that's why gender responsive education in emergency is critical, because it requires us to systematically understand the differentiated patterns in learning between both boys and girls, men and women, to see that we address all these differentiated patterns and the root causes of these patterns in the new structures that we build. That's what will help us make sure we do not reinforce barriers that are old and pre-existing.
Thank you, Adam. Arundhati.
COVID has rapidly accelerated adoption of digital services. In India in 2020, women's ownership of smartphones grew faster than the rate it grew for men. So I would say that is the disruption that we definitely have to seize. We can't do business as usual in terms of technology adoption and technology services. The crisis and the setback, I think, is in the economic recovery and how that's impacted most women in the workplace. More women have left the workplace than men, and that's the setback that I think is in the larger topic that I'm looking at, given India's already low rate, something we have to actively ensure doesn't dip even further.
Thank you. Chan, I see that you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I think that COVID or any crisis actually identify the existing problems that we had. And it is a perfect time for all of us to closely working together to create a short-term, middle-term, and long-term positive impact, not just responding to the crisis, but building back better, so we don't replicate the existing problems. So yes, definitely the crisis both impose the challenges, but also open up new opportunities. Like we just hear from the scholar, for example, technology or the mindset and the need to transform the mindset for long-term impact.
Great, thank you, Chan. Nangila, unfortunately, I think because of time, I'm going to have to turn us back to Eden. All of the scholars mentioned the importance of talking with girls and young women, and this is why we wanted to reach out to Eden as a young woman activist who could really help to lay out the challenge for us at the beginning of this conversation. But not only that, but also to highlight what for her are the main takeaways. So Eden, I would like to invite you back to share with us, what are you taking away from this conversation, and what do you hope that policymakers, practitioners, and other girls' education advocates will learn about what needs to be done to protect girls' rights and futures in times of crisis?
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And thank you all so much for the insightful discussion. I understand, or I believe that we can all play a key role in responding to the global challenges surrounding girls' education. My key takeaways from this discussion is, first of all, how important it is to promote safe and inclusive schools. It is always important to construct and rehabilitate schools that ensure a safe and inclusive learning environment for girls, but especially now during times of crisis. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, collective action, engage different stakeholders in the discussion and implementation of the different programs. These are community leaders, religious leaders, teachers, and of course, family members. Second of all, removing barriers to schooling. So engaging parents, again, school leaders, and addressing the social and cultural norms and perception that prevent girls' education. Addressing the financial barriers through scholarships and grants is also one way of tackling that. And third of all, addressing safety, especially now during a global pandemic. One way of doing this, again, was mentioned during the discussion, was by leveraging technology and innovation to enable perhaps remote learning. Third of all, supplementing education with mentorship, as Arundhati mentioned. This is also very personal for me because I've had several mentors, and I still do, who have played an instrumental role in my beliefs, my values, and my success, and I thank them very much. And I would like to pass on the torch to other young girls, and I would encourage you all to do the same. Mentorship increases employment prospects for young people, which is extremely important. But in the long run, it will create pathways for sustainable economic development. Personalized education for girls. So having focus group discussions with girls to better understand their needs and adapting that into a curriculum. And then also investing in teachers, right? Because we have to provide professional development for teachers so that they are able to serve better. And then providing teachers training on curriculum development and digital literacy so that the quality of the content that they teach is also improved. And then, of course, investing in grassroots organizations, because from my experience working with them, they're very much active on the ground, working with different stakeholders. And then last but not least, developing life skills for girls, promoting girls' empowerment, skills development through different programs and social cohesion trainings and so on. And then prioritizing and promoting women in STEM programs, which I think is also very important. So protecting girls' education is much more than policies and donor funding and philanthropy programs. It's also about stakeholder engagement, community activism, and supporting brilliant scholars such as Tran, Idem, Arundhati, and Nangalai to continue their groundbreaking research and impactful interventions. So thank you so much.
Thank you again so much, Eden. It's been wonderful to have you join us today. Thank you to all of our Echidna Global Scholars. I say it all the time that it's a privilege to work with you, and I mean it every time I say it. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. Please continue this conversation on Twitter using the hashtag EGSP21, and we hope to see you all again in our virtual workshops. The first one starts in about an hour, so hope to see you there. And take care. Stay safe and healthy, everyone. Thank you.